I was having coffee recently with a friend who had just turned down a massive career-defining promotion. As he explained his reasoning, he was incredibly passionate, almost glowing with this sense of moral clarity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he told me he rejected the role because he wanted to, and I quote, prioritize his authentic self, and that the company's corporate values no longer resonated with his spirit.
Right. The big, noble reason.
Exactly. And he wasn't nervous or shifty at all. He looked me dead in the eye. His voice was steady, full of conviction. He genuinely believed he was making some kind of noble sacrifice.
You knew something else.
But here's the reality I knew from a mutual acquaintance. He didn't just turn it down. He had actually panicked during the final negotiations. The new role required a lot of public speaking, something he is terrified of, and he sabotaged the whole deal over a minor salary dispute, basically to save face.
There it is.
Yet, watching him sit there, sipping his latte and preaching about authenticity, I realized something fascinating. He wasn't lying to me. Not really. If he were consciously making up this story, there would be cognitive tells, a hesitation, a broken gaze, maybe a bead of sweat.
The usual giveaways.
But because he had successfully deceived himself first, he could sell the lie to me with total physiological calm. He had rewritten the narrative from, I was scared, to, I am too principled for them, and he believed it 100%.
He was his own first customer.
It was a perfect real-world example of this kind of disturbing biological truth. The voice in your head isn't the CEO making rational decisions. It's a press secretary, hurriedly writing a press release to justify actions your subconscious has already taken.
That analogy is immensely helpful, and it really sets the stage perfectly for what we're investigating today. Our mission in this deep dive is to really dig into that disturbing biological truth, the neurobiological mechanisms, the cognitive pathways through which your brain's press secretary module actively suppresses or, reinterprets objective information.
And it does this for a reason.
It does. The immediate purpose of this whole mechanism is what we call adaptive self-deception. It's usually aimed at reducing your cognitive load and, crucially, improving your performance during complex social interactions.
Okay, so let's unpack this from an evolutionary standpoint, because this seems to present a profound puzzle. I mean, we generally assume natural selection favors organisms with the most accurate nervous systems, right?
No.
The ones best equipped to see reality as it actually is.
That's the classical view, yes.
So why would evolution deliberately favor a mechanism, self-deception, that literally cuts us off from reality? It feels completely counterintuitive that the better you are at lying to yourself, the fitter you become.
It is counterintuitive, but only if you assume the sole function of the human brain is objective truth processing. The answer really comes from Robert Trevers, who's an eminent evolutionary biologist. And his work just fundamentally shifted how we view deception.
So what was his big idea?
His central and pretty provocative thesis is that self-deception is not primarily a defensive mechanism to soothe our own feelings. Rather, it's an offensive function. As he put it, we lie to ourselves that are to lie to others.
So the key benefit isn't internal comfort, it's social weaponry. If I truly believe my own manufactured narrative, like your friend who believed he was morally superior, I become a much more convincing fraudster.
Precisely. The logic is just so elegant and robust. If the conscious mind is shielded from the uncomfortable truth, and that truth is sort of confined to the less accessible unconscious, the individual is far less likely to leak those physical cues that reveal the deceit.
The things we pick up on.
Exactly. We're remarkably good at detecting lies. We pick up micro-expressions, subtle shifts in speech, intonation, hesitation, weird eye movements, all that stuff.
But if I'm not consciously managing a falsehood, if I've manufactured a single reality that I fully inhabit, those cognitive tells just, well, they disappear.
That's the fundamental advantage. The lack of internal conflict eliminates the tells. And what's more, this also significantly reduces the cognitive burden of deception.
The mental energy.
Think of the mental energy required to consciously track and manage two conflicting realities, the truth and the lie, moment by moment. If you believe your own press release, the act of deception becomes effortless.
And what happens if the deception is discovered, if someone calls my bluff?
Even then, even if the deceit is detected, self-deception provides this massive advantage, plausible deniability. If you truly convinced yourself, you can genuinely claim, I was acting in good faith, or I wasn't aware of the full implications.
Which minimizes the fallout.
It minimizes the social or legal retribution that might follow, which is a powerful survival mechanism in a highly social species like ours.
That makes me think of an early, kind of famous anecdotal example from history. Charles Darwin, in his autobiography, he wrote about his youth. He described stealing apples, but only to give them away to young men he knew, after first showing off how quickly he could run.
Right, I remember this one.
He noted that he failed to perceive that the surprise and admiration they expressed at his speed was given solely for the sake of obtaining the stolen apples.
That is a perfect early illustration of the press secretary at work. Darwin's conscious mind framed the act as this pure display of athletic prowess, worthy of admiration. The transactional reality, the theft and the bribe, was just relegated to the unconscious.
So he could get away with it in his own mind.
He was able to engage in a morally questionable act while maintaining a conscious, self-glorifying narrative of his superior running speed. It enabled the act while preserving his self-image.
Oh, if the conscious mind is indeed the press secretary, then the crucial question becomes, what is the psychological architecture that allows for this successful deception? It fundamentally implies that we are not a single unified self.
You've hit the absolute core of the psychological mechanism. The architecture relies fundamentally on the dissociation between different mental processes. We're dealing with a non-unitary mind. Parts of it are operating autonomously.
So that's how the conflict is managed?
This is how the internal conflict is managed. True information is preferentially excluded from consciousness and stored unconsciously, while the fabricated or selective falsehood is consciously maintained. The wall between these two sets of information is where self-deception operates.
Let's delve into how this split manifests in real-world ethical choices. I'm thinking particularly about how we see otherwise principled individuals engaging in highly questionable behavior without seemingly realizing they are violating their own moral code.
That phenomenon is known as ethical fading. It describes the psychological forces that allow the ethical or moral aspects of a decision to just fade into the background.
So you don't even see the ethical dimension anymore.
Exactly. It allows individuals to pursue self-interested, even unethical behavior, while simultaneously maintaining the conscious belief that their moral principles are totally intact. It's the internal con game that ensures the press secretary's narrative holds up.
So what are the primary tools the press secretary uses to make this ethical fading happen?
Well, researchers have identified 4 specific enablers. The first one is language euphemisms. This involves using softened language to obscure the harm or moral implications of an action.
Right, so calling a bribe a consulting fee or corporate restructuring when it really means massive layoffs, it just sanitizes the action.
Precisely. The language frames the action as neutral or necessary or purely business, not as an immoral act. The second enabler is the slippery slope effect.
We hear about the slippery slope all the time, but how does it specifically relate to self-deception?
It relates through incremental moral desensitization. The individual starts with small, mildly unethical actions that are really easy to rationalize. Because the steps are so incremental, moral sensitivity is numbed over time.
So you don't notice the change.
Cumulatively, these small rationalized steps pave the way for a major unethical action that, by that point, seems entirely justifiable because the moral compass has just been slowly calibrated downward.
Okay, what's the third one?
The third is errors in perceptual causation, which sounds like a deflection mechanism.
And it is one.
That's exactly what it is. This involves biased causal attributions used to deflect personal blame onto external factors or onto other people. Instead of admitting, I failed because I didn't prepare, the person says, I feel because the parameters were unfair or because my colleague gave me bad data.
It preserves the conscious self-image of competence and morality by basically outsourcing the cause of failure.
Yes, and that leads right into the final enabler, which is the ongoing work of the press secretary itself.
Yeah.
Self-serving self-representations.
Keeping that positive story about yourself going.
This is the paramount need to maintain a relentlessly positive view of the self that overrides moral considerations. If the internal conscious narrative is, I am a good, principled, smart person, then any contradictory, unethical action has to be reframed. Preserving that positive self-view means the ethical implications of your actions have to be diminished or rationalized or just flat out ignored.
So the dissociation is fundamental. Let's look at the specific psychological dualisms that make this fading possible. First up, the split between explicit and implicit attitudes.
Right. So explicit attitudes are the conscious beliefs we hold and state publicly. For example, I am committed to diversity and fairness. Implicit attitudes are the biases that reside unconsciously, often less accessible and sometimes, socially undesirable.
And one drives our behavior when we're being watched and the other when we're not.
Sort of. When the behavioral consequences are clear and attributable, explicit attitudes generally drive behavior.
But the press secretary finds an opening when things get a little murky.
Exactly. When attribution for behavior is ambiguous, when there is plausible deniability, the implicit, undesirable attitudes can take over. Think of a hiring manager with an implicit bias against a certain demographic.
Okay.
They won't act on it if the top candidate from that demographic is just vastly superior.
Yeah.
But if the candidates are roughly equal and the qualifications are a bit vague, that implicit bias can drive the discriminatory decision.
And the manager can then genuinely claim they just chose the best fit, maintaining that conscious belief in their own fairness.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The conscious self remains convinced of its own neutrality because the actual reason for the choice was buried. We see a similar split with controlled versus automatic processes. How does this play out with our long-term goals and maybe self-sabotage?
Oh, this is a good one.
This is the dualism of conscious goals versus hidden, actual goals. Imagine a student whose conscious, controlled goal is majoring in biology to please their parents by going to medical school.
A very common scenario.
Simultaneously, an automatic, unconscious goal, a deep desire to be an artist perhaps, is operating right beneath the surface. This unconscious desire might lead to subtle self-sabotaging behavior, chronic procrastination, forgetting crucial study sessions, or just poor time management.
And the behavior leads inevitably to failure. The student doesn't get into medical school, and that's when the press secretary earns its money.
Absolutely. The failure is instantly rationalized as being externally caused. The curve was too steep, or the professors were biased, or I wasn't feeling well before the entrance exam. The true internal conflict and the unconscious goal that led to the sabotaging behavior are completely obscured.
Which maintains the student's positive self-image and lets them get parental sympathy rather than disapproval.
Exactly.
So we've covered actions and goals, but self-deception also requires rewriting the past. Memory isn't just a passive archive, it's an active tool of the press secretary.
Memory bias is one of the most powerful mechanisms. The mind actively manages the timeline. Information that's inconsistent with our preferences is selectively forgotten, or recalled inaccurately, or actively distorted. Studies consistently show that people have measurably better recall for their own good behavior than for their bad behavior.
But not for other people's behavior.
A bias that does not extend when they are recalling the actions of others. No.
Can you give a specific example of this kind of retrospective self-deception? How do researchers actually catch people in the act of misremembering their own past performance?
There's a great study. Researchers tested participants who took a study skills class. Before the class started, participants rated their current study skills. Then, after the class, the researchers found that participants actively misremembered their prior study skills as being lower than they had originally rated them.
Wait. They actively manufactured a past that was worse than reality.
Exactly. This distortion strongly supported their conscious belief that their skills had significantly improved because of the class. They manufactured a lower baseline to enhance their perception of gain.
That is incredible.
And it gets better. They later even misremembered their subsequent course performance as being better than it actually was, all to maintain that fiction of overall improvement.
Yeah.
They weren't just self-enhancing in the moment, they were creating this robust fictional narrative of growth and success.
If that's how we manage the past, we must also manage incoming information to keep the narrative intact, what we call biased information processing or motivational reasoning.
Right. We actively curate the input. The first technique is controlling the amount of searching. People tend to stop searching for information once the initial returns are welcome.
That classic aphorism, "what I don't know can't hurt me," is basically the guiding philosophy of informational avoidance.
It's deeply compelling. The classic lab demonstration of this involved participants checking for a hypothetical pancreatic disorder. The test was a strip that would change color in their saliva. When participants were led to believe that a color change indicated a good health prognosis, they were eager for the result and waited a normal amount of time. However, when they believed the color change indicated a bad prognosis, they subconsciously stalled.
How long did they stall?
They waited 60% longer for the test strip to change color when they feared it would deliver bad news. It's a clear demonstration of an attempt to just delay the arrival of potentially unwelcome information.
Beyond just avoidance, there's selective searching, which we see constantly in the digital age.
This is seeking out information sources that reliably confirm one's existing worldview. We observe this constantly in media consumption, choosing news outlets or social media feeds that are known to align with our established political or cultural narratives.
You build your own echo chamber.
By limiting input to compatible sources, people ensure that the majority of information they gather will be consistent with their established press secretary narrative, which allows them to sidestep uncomfortable truths altogether.
And the final step in processing unwelcome information is biased interpretation or selective skepticism. If the truth is unavoidable, we just dismiss it as flawed.
This is perhaps the most crucial mechanism for maintaining attitude polarization. Consider the classic study involving participants who were pre-selected for having strongly held opposing views on capital punishment.
Okay, so you have two entrenched groups.
And they were then exposed to a mixed bag of evidence. Some studies supporting the deterrent effect of capital punishment, some opposing it.
Logically, confronting mixed, credible evidence should lead to some moderation, right? Or at least some convergence of attitudes.
That's the logical expectation. However, the exact opposite occurred. The participants ended the experiment more polarized than they began.
More? How?
Those in favor of capital punishment accepted the supporting data as sound, but rigorously rejected the opposing data as flawed. The anti-capital punishment group showed the exact mirror image of this pattern.
So this selective skepticism is the press secretary performing damage control on external evidence. We rigorously scrutinize data that opposes our beliefs while giving a complete free pass to any supporting data.
It requires an active expenditure of mental resources. The individual has a potential awareness that an unbiased appraisal exists, but they deploy skepticism differentially to ensure their existing belief structure remains completely intact.
This psychological machinery is just running constantly, protecting our ethics, managing our goals, curating our information intake. That brings us to the next much broader question. I've talked about the how, now let's talk about the pervasive where. Where does the press secretary show up most ubiquitously in daily life?
The single most common and enduring expression of self-deception is self-enhancement. This is the deep-seated, universal tendency to think of oneself or one's group as fundamentally better, smarter, more moral, more attractive, or more skilled than the average person.
The classic better-than-average effect, which is, of course, mathematically impossible for the majority of the population to hold, yet it's psychologically universal.
It truly is. It persists globally, across cultures. Even in societies like East Asia, where overt social norms require humility, individuals still show clear self-enhancement. They just often focus on collectivist qualities, or they'll claim down publicly while they believe up implicitly.
The depth of this belief is actually measurable, isn't it?
It is. How do you measure something that deep?
That's what I'm wondering.
Researchers used a really clever experiment involving self-perception distortion. Participants were shown photos of themselves that were subtly morphed to varying degrees, with either highly attractive or highly unattractive images. Then, they were asked to identify which image was their actual photograph.
And what did they choose?
They were consistently more likely to identify the photo morphed 10% toward attractiveness as their actual image. The speed with which they identified these enhanced images strongly suggested that the attractive version is what most closely matches their self-image in their mind's eye.
They genuinely believed the self-enhancing story about their own personal appearance.
That makes the job of the press secretary look very busy, constantly pumping up our self-image. The flip side of this self-enhancement is, of course, other-derogation. If I can't enhance myself further, I can just tear down my rivals.
It's the twin engine of self-esteem.
The derogation of rivals or outgroup members actively, measurably raises the individual's self-esteem. One study demonstrated this mechanism starkly. Non-Jewish participants were given feedback that they had performed poorly on an IQ test, a significant acute threat to their self-esteem.
Okay.
They then participated in a subsequent task where they had to rate a job applicant who was ostensibly either Jewish or Christian.
So if they just failed the IQ test, they'd be highly motivated to restore their positive self-view, and fast.
Precisely. When rating the Christian applicant, the failure on the IQ test had no measurable effect on their ratings. But when they rated the Jewish applicant, those who thought they had failed the IQ test rated the applicant significantly and negatively on personality traits.
And did it work?
Crucially, these individuals showed a demonstrable rebound in their own self-esteem after derogating the outgroup member.
So they used self-deception to convince themselves the other person was flawed, and that external judgment successfully restored their internal sense of value.
It confirms that this isn't just external boasting. Self-deception, in this context, works as an offensive tool to advance socially and psychologically, ensuring the individual maintains a positive self-view by displacing perceived flaws onto others.
We've established the evolutionary benefits, but there has to be a cost to all this pervasive self-deception. If it is so adaptive for social success, why do people who live a double life often report high stress and anxiety? Let's address the elephant in the room, the immune cost.
Trivers points out that there is a profound biological trade-off. There seems to be a general rule in human physiology. Suppressing the truth is costly to your immune function and your overall health. The primary link seems to be internal conflict and stress interfering with essential processes like sleep.
Right. Sleep is when the body conducts its deepest immune repair and cellular maintenance. So if the press secretary is running an all-night operation to manage and maintain the narrative, it would logically interfere with that whole repair process.
That's the suggested mechanism. The psychological burden of constant inhibition and the mental energy required to manage multiple, conflicting realities generates this chronic stress that profoundly interferes with high-quality sleep. The long-term consequences are quite severe.
What does the data show regarding the health outcomes for people who are forced to maintain a high-stakes deception about their identity?
The findings are quite stark. Studies have shown that individuals forced to conceal fundamental aspects of their identity, such as their sexual orientation or critical health information, like their HIV status, show measurable associations with significantly impaired immune function and often earlier mortality.
So this moves beyond a mere psychological issue and becomes a literal biological disaster.
Trivers famously described the former U.S. military policy, don't ask, don't tell, as an immunological disaster, because it forced thousands of healthy, functional individuals into a state of continuous, costly, health-eroding psychological inhibition just to maintain their professional position. The psychological burden of managing that lie taxes the physical system.
Conversely, if self-deception costs our immune system, then the opposite, simple honesty, should boost it.
And that is exactly what the research shows. The power of disclosure is remarkable. Controlled studies have revealed that simple, honest reflection, like keeping a private journal about a traumatic event that is free of self-deception or rationalization, consistently improves immune function.
So the relief of that internal conflict allows for better sleep and consequently better immune repair.
Yes. But then we have the paradox of religion. Many religious beliefs involve some form of reality evasion, faith superseding reason, yet religious people often report health and longevity benefits. How do we square that circle?
That's a good question.
That's where the benefits of social connection seem to offset the costs of reality evasion. While religious doctrine can often promote self-deception by encouraging in-group superiority and reality evasion, the core structural benefit is guaranteed community membership and social support.
The community aspect.
That strong social fabric and support network in times of crisis is a known powerful buffer against stress, and it improves individual immune function, which counteracts the stress generated by the reality evasion.
Okay, let's shift now to high-stakes applications where the costs of self-deception become external and, well, catastrophic. Starting with the professional domain of finance.
Self-deception, particularly in the form of overconfidence, leads to measurable economic costs. Studies analyzing stock market trading behavior reveal really consistent sex differences in overconfidence.
Let me guess. Males are more overconfident.
Males exhibit significantly higher levels of overconfidence than females. This overconfidence, often buoyed by the self-enhancing narrative of the press secretary, leads to greater risk-taking, excessive trading volume, and ultimately poorer long-term outcomes.
The narrative of being the master of the universe in the trading world can literally cost you millions. And on an organizational scale, the consequences can be truly disastrous.
They can be fatal. The 1982 Washington, D.C. plane crash is a honking example. Analysis of the cockpit audio tape showed the pilot engaged in a consistent pattern of reality evasion, repeatedly playing down the amount of snow and ice accumulated on the wings just before attempting takeoff.
He had a narrative that said, I am an expert pilot, I know what I'm doing, this is fine.
And that self-deception severely restricted his awareness of the critical, dangerous reality of the environment. The critical safety information was minimized to preserve his self-image of control and competence, leading directly to the loss of life.
And that anecdote also illustrates how power amplifies this problem. The person with the most power is often the most insulated and therefore the most prone to self-deception and denial.
We saw this organizational failure illustrated so dramatically in the investigation of the Challenger space shuttle disaster.
A classic case study.
That case is a textbook example of higher-order organizational self-deception. Richard Feynman, the Nobel-winning physicist who investigated the crash, he pointed out these structural flaws where managers who had the greatest power actively refused to listen to factual evidence presented by lower-level engineers about the temperature vulnerability of the O-rings.
So the organization's brain had the crucial, true information in its unconscious, the engineering reports. But the conscious management press secretary system denied that information to maintain a narrative of mission readiness and success.
It was institutional failure rooted in power dynamics. The powerful deny the facts presented by the powerless, which allows them to present the organization as safer, better, and more reliable than it truly is. Power, in essence, is a powerful predictor of self-deception.
This denial then moves to the largest scale, the group level, influencing history and war.
Overconfidence is arguably the most ancient and dangerous form of group self-deception. In warfare, leaders who are often insulated from the biological costs, meaning they are not the ones fighting and dying, are highly prone to ignoring intelligence reports and severely underestimating their opponent. The collective press secretary narrative just takes hold.
The 2003 U.S. war on Iraq is often cited as a clear example of this institutional and collective self-deception.
It's a prime case study where self-deception was aimed at both the international community and, crucially, one's own citizens. It was fueled by multiple mechanisms of denial, promoting severe overconfidence in the speed and ease of victory, underestimating the opponent's resilience, and deliberately ignoring or walling off intelligence reports that conflicted with the desired outcome.
And the cost was immense.
The immense cost was wasted manpower and resources, all fueled by a collective fantasy.
This pattern is so deeply ingrained even in how nations construct their own histories. They practice a form of historical amnesia.
Nations create highly selective, often false, historical narratives for self-glorification. It enables them to evade base motives or horrific past actions. If you examine the founding of the U.S., for instance, the foundational myth often glosses over the true nature of early interactions with indigenous populations.
You're referring to the active suppression of facts that conflict with that narrative of moral superiority.
Exactly. For example, George Washington, speaking of Native American settlements, is quoted as saying the objectives are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements. It'll be essential to ruin their crops in the ground and prevent their planting more. Nations choose to forget or rationalize such actions to maintain a pure, positive, and superior foundational identity. The press secretary writes the history books.
It's disturbing how this pervasive tendency to ignore uncomfortable facts and focus on a narrative of superiority is just everywhere. But perhaps the most surprising place it shows up is in science, the one institution supposedly built explicitly on anti-self-deception methods.
That is the ultimate conflict. Science is meant to be governed by explicit hypotheses, rigorous experimentation, and a constant open acceptance of opposing facts. Yet, today's competitive environment, particularly the pressure for tenure and publication, combined with the sheer size of modern data sets, it creates a perfect breeding ground for unconscious biases.
This is the context for the now infamous reproducibility crisis, where these large-scale replication attempts in fields like psychology and oncology failed to reproduce the majority of landmark findings.
The scale of that failure is just too large to attribute solely to fraud. If we assume the vast majority of researchers are honest, the problem has to be rooted in unconscious cognitive biases facilitated by the brain's press secretary.
It's the environment.
The competitive climate, it's been dubbed the steroids era of social science, creates this unconscious incentive to find statistically significant results, specifically targeting the conventional p-value threshold of 0.05. When your career hinges on that number, you develop a powerful unconscious stake in the outcome.
And the complexity of modern data makes it so easy to find what you're looking for, even accidentally. Our intuition just can't handle hundreds of variables and distinguish a faint signal from random noise.
That difficulty is exploited by 4 primary cognitive fallacies that allow self-deception to run rampant in the research process.
Okay, let's start with the first one, hypothesis myopia.
This is the failure to consider alternative explanations. Researchers will fixate on gathering evidence to support one favored hypothesis while neglecting to search for evidence that might contradict it or support a competing idea. They design experiments whose primary outcome is likely to confirm the hypothesis they already believe in.
The common example cited for this is research linking disgust to moral condemnation.
Right. In those studies, participants might be exposed to an unpleasant stimulus, say a messy room or a foul odor, and then asked to judge moral transgressions. If the exposed participants favor harsher punishments, the researchers declare the discuss hypothesis is supported.
But they're missing something.
But they often neglect to consider that the participants might just be reacting out of simple anger or annoyance at their foul treatment, missing the actual causal mechanism entirely.
This myopia has devastating high-stakes consequences, particularly in legal settings where statistical evidence is involved.
The Sally Clark conviction in the UK is a heartbreaking illustration of hypothesis myopia. She was convicted of murdering her 2 sons, based partly on flawed statistical evidence. A key expert testified that the chance of 2 children in the same family dying of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDs, was roughly 1 in 73 million.
An astronomical figure.
And it was presented as damning evidence of murder.
But focusing on how unlikely SIDs was only addresses one possibility.
It completely ignores the other possibility, which is murder. The jury failed to weigh the relative likelihood of the 2 competing hypotheses, accidental death versus murder. A later, more rigorous statistical analysis showed that while a double SID's death would occur in roughly 1 out of 297,000 families, the likelihood of 2 children being murdered by a parent in a similar family was estimated to be only 1 out of 2.7 million families.
So based on the actual likelihood ratio, double SIDs was significantly more likely than double murder.
A statistician found the likelihood ratio was 9-to-1 against murder. Focusing only on the unlikelihood of the SID's hypothesis, without factoring in the even greater unlikelihood of the murder hypothesis, led directly to a wrongful conviction. It was thankfully later overturned. That is the real-world cost of hypothesis myopia.
The second fallacy is the notorious Texas sharpshooter, drawing the target around the bullet holes after you've already fired.
This is seizing on random patterns in the data and mistaking them for meaningful, statistically significant findings. Researchers today have dozens of analytical options: how to clean data, which variables to include, how to treat outliers, which control group to select. The sharpshooter bias is choosing the single analytical path that yields the agreeable results.
And this is the practice of p-hacking.
This is p-hacking, yes.
How widespread is this manipulation of results?
A survey of U.S. psychologists found widespread admission of these self-deceptive practices. Over half admitted to selectively reporting only the studies that worked. 58% admitted to peeking at results early to decide whether to collect more data.
That's a huge number.
And 43% admitted to dropping data points only after checking their impact on the p-value. They defended these practices, which just shows how normalized this unconscious self-deception has become in the pursuit of publication.
And the chocolate hoax perfectly demonstrated how simple it is to manufacture a result.
A journalist and a documentary filmmaker deliberately designed an experiment to prove that eating chocolate leads to weight loss. They collected 18 different measurements: weight, cholesterol, sleep quality, everything, on a tiny sample of only 15 people.
So the odds were high something would pop up.
With that many variables and that small a sample size, the odds were incredibly high that some random correlation would appear statistically significant. They just cherry-picked the 3 variables that achieved the desired result and published them, showcasing how creative or even just beer-fueled p-hacking can prove almost anything you want it to.
That demonstrates the raw power of the motivation to find something publishable. The third cognitive trap is asymmetric attention.
This is the disconfirmation bias applied to data checking. When results align with your expectations, when the press secretary is happy, you give the data a free pass and scrutinize it very little. But when results conflict with your theory, when the data is unwelcome, you rigorously check the non-intuitive outcomes.
And you almost always blame the method, not the theory.
You almost always blame the experimental method rather than your core theory. It's the press secretary saying, "This information confirms our narrative, file it away. This information is bad, find the error immediately."
It makes sense.
Absolutely. One study of molecular biology labs found that in a staggering 88% of cases where results didn't align with expectations, the scientists blamed the experimental method or faulty equipment, not their own theoretical assumptions.
And what about in psychology?
Even more telling, an analysis of published psychology papers found that when large p-value errors were detected, over 90% of the mistakes favored the researchers' expectations, meaning the error turned a non-significant finding into a significant one. They unconsciously directed their attention to fix the bad data that threatened publication, not the good data that supported their theory.
The final trap is the narrative layer, just so storytelling. We rationalize the results after the fact, making them sound profound and predicted, even when they're entirely random.
This refers to Rudyard Kipling's whimsical tales about how animals got their spots and stripes. In science, this manifests in two primary forms. The first is H.R. King, hypothesizing after results are known. Researchers find an unexpected or accidental finding, but then report it in the final paper as having been carefully predicted from the start.
It gives the paper the appearance of foresight and careful design, rather than being a lucky accident that happened to be statistically significant.
And the second is jarking, justifying after results are known. When results are non-significant, when they fail to meet that 0.05 threshold, researchers use these creative phrases to convince readers that the results are still important.
Oh, I've seen these.
Statisticians have collected hundreds of hilarious, if depressing, examples, results that are flirting with conventional levels of significance or on the very fringes of significance, or, my favorite, not absolutely significant, but very probably so.
They're essentially explaining everything and therefore explaining nothing just to avoid admitting their hypothesis failed.
Exactly.
So we've identified the 4 cognitive fallacies that allow the press secretary to flourish in the lab. If these cognitive biases are hitting the accelerator, the need to spot relationships and get published, then we need rigorous structural solutions to strengthen the brake, the ability to slow down, be skeptical, and eliminate false positives.
We must intentionally design protocols that fight our instincts. The first solution is called strong inference, or devil's advocacy. This is the explicit consideration and testing of competing hypotheses head-to-head.
This directly attacks hypothesis myopia. Instead of asking, does my theory work, you force yourself to ask, can my single experiment distinguish between my theory and 3 plausible competing alternatives?
It compels researchers to design experiments that clearly differentiate between explanations for their observations. It drastically reduces the tendency to fall back on those post-hoc just-so stories to explain whatever result happens to appear.
The second solution is transparency and pre-commitment, which requires tying the researcher's hands before the press secretary even gets a chance to look at the data.
This is the philosophy of open science, promoting the public sharing of methods and data. The core idea is that since researchers have enormous unconscious flexibility in how they analyze and what they report, we need to remove that flexibility before the results are known.
So you pre-commit to a plan.
The only way to mitigate the influence of unconscious biases is to pre-commit to an analysis and reporting plan in advance.
And the most radical extension of this, which I think is fascinating, is the registered report.
In a registered report, the entire research plan, the theoretical justification, methods, analysis strategy, everything is submitted for peer review before the experiment is even run. If the methodology is approved, publication is guaranteed.
Regardless of the result.
Regardless of whether the results are strong, weak, or non-significant.
That's powerful because it completely removes the unconscious temptation to warp the data analysis to secure that precious publication slot. The reviewers are forced to evaluate the quality of the question and the methodology, not the outcome, and the researcher's internal bias has no motive to engage in packing.
It also holds the reviewers to account. They can't just discount a study because they don't find the results congenial. The third technique is team of rivals, or adversarial collaboration.
This sounds psychologically painful, forcing researchers who fundamentally disagree to work in the same lab.
It is, but it's remarkably effective, especially for controversial topics or large-scale replication attempts. You invite your academic rivals, those who hold the opposing hypothesis, to work with you on a study.
And because their motivation is to disprove your theory.
They quickly spot your biases, like hypothesis myopia or asymmetric attention, and these biases tend to cancel each other out.
They police each other's press secretaries.
Precisely. One collaborative team attempting to replicate research on eye movements and memory retrieval failed to replicate the original finding. But crucially, the researchers noted that while the debate wasn't resolved, the adversarial collaboration generated new testable ideas and brought the opposing parties slightly closer, because they had to agree on the fundamental methodology.
That's a massive institutional commitment, forcing scientists to basically put their theories on the guillotine. The final technique, blind data analysis, seems to be the highest form of intellectual hygiene adopted from physics.
It's an established tradition in high-stakes fields. The goal is to ensure researchers literally do not know how close they are to their desired results, preventing them from unconsciously finding what they are looking for. Researchers analyze data that looks real, but is intentionally shifted or obscured by a known offset. maybe random noise is added, or participants are moved to different groups, an amount known only to a trusted third party or a computer script.
So the researchers run the full analysis handling outliers, cleaning the data, finalizing the protocol on fake data. They optimize the analysis plan, and only once that plan is locked in is it applied to the real data.
Exactly. They do not know if their current results represent scientific treasures or detritus until the blind is lifted at the very end. This prevents any post-facto fiddling or accidental packing, ensuring that the results are robust.
And the highest stakes application of this method was in the supernova cosmology project, dealing with the fundamental fate of the universe.
That team used blind data analysis to confirm their estimates of dark energy and matter. They were tackling fundamental cosmology, trying to determine if the universe would expand forever or collapse. The potential for the researchers' strong prior biases to unconsciously influence the results was just enormous.
So they blinded the data.
By shifting the data by amount known only to the computer, they ensured that their biases did not influence the crucial, world-changing confirmation of an accelerating, expanding universe.
That sense of suspense for the young researchers who spent years under that blind must have been immense, waiting for the results to finally be revealed.
It was. There's a wonderful anecdote about a graduate student who'd spent 2 years analyzing supernova pairs under a data blind. When the team was finally ready to unblind the data, they considered waiting until morning because, as one of them noted, if the result was wrong, it's going to be a very disappointing evening, and she's going to have to think really hard about what she's going to do with her PhD thesis.
But they did it anyway.
But they unblinded it right then, the results were excellent, and they cheered. That level of intellectual hygiene gives the result an undeniable safety and assurance.
So we've covered a vast territory. We started with the evolutionary foundation from Robert Trivers, that self-deception is this ancient, adaptive tool to help us lie effectively to others, and move through the complex psychological divisions or dissociations that enable it.
We traced its pervasive scope, showing up everywhere from our personal enhancement biases and measurable immune costs, to organizational disaster, international conflict, and even national historical narratives.
And finally, we explored how this unconscious drive fuels the crisis of reproducibility in science and the rigorous debiasing techniques needed to fight the press secretary in the lab.
Self-deception, in its many forms, it operates by splitting the mind. You have true information stored unconsciously and a persuasive, self-glorifying falsehood stored consciously.
Whether it's ethical fading that lets us off the moral hook, motivational reasoning that screens out unwelcome information, or falling into the Texas sharpshooter trap in research, the brain's press secretary is constantly at work, providing us with a comfortable and self-flattering narrative of the world.
And that leaves us with the permanent tension of the human condition. The trade-off between the undeniable benefits of self-enhancement, which fosters necessary confidence and social success, and the potentially catastrophic costs of informational loss on our personal health, organizational safety, and global stability.
The ultimate measure of mental health may not be the absence of bias, but the ability to believe one's own self-enhancing stories, or perhaps the most profound act of self-deception in the modern world is refusing to acknowledge the power of the press secretary residing within us all.